just because marketing hasn't worked yet doesn't mean it's not going to work in the future. That's not a wholly convincing argument. But we do then slip into the debate that we have done this morning already, for or against e-cigarettes. But proposing this legislation isn't for an outright ban on e-cigarettes. It is to ensure that e-cigarettes are used in the same places as tobacco. So it's not an outright ban, and we're not seeking to close down the shops on the high street. I prefer to have a few more fruit shops than your e-cigarette shops, but there we go, that's the difference, right? But what we're looking at doing is normalising, if you like, or ensuring that e-cigarettes are used in the same category as tobacco cigarettes, i.e. that for most enclosed public spaces, the action and the behaviour of smoking, be it vaping or whether it be smoking tobacco, is not a normal part of our lives and our society. Now, I would be surprised if either of you could disagree with that, quite honestly.
One of the reasons why, I've worked for 17 years doing research in smoking cessation, and we've struggled for all these years to get people to use our excellent stop smoking services, and you've got fantastic stop smoking services in Wales. And one of the reasons for that is that they're not appealing. And nicotine replacement therapy, unfortunately, has never really taken off in the way that it could have done because it's not appealing. And one of the things about the hand-to-mouth nature of e-cigarettes and the product is actually, it is like smoking. And that's one of the reasons why it's easier for people to switch, and one of the reasons why it has an appeal, because it has those sensory triggers as well as the nicotine delivery. So I think it is unfortunate, you're right, that it's the same kind of gestures, and I understand where people's concerns about that come from, but it's also a success story, because we're seeing people using these devices to stop smoking, in many cases gradually, exactly because it's a similar behaviour. So we really have to strike the balance there, and I don't think that treating them exactly like tobacco in public places is the solution.
I would also argue that to practical purposes, the situation we have in most public places that I visit is exactly what you've described, which is that out of courtesy to others and out of simple good manners, people don't vape indoors any more than they smoke indoors. People don't vape indoors any more than they smoke indoors. But to prohibit a product in the same way as a tobacco product, which, as Ms. Williams has said, was brought in to protect staff, doesn't make sense for a product that almost certainly doesn't present any harm to others and to bystanders indoors. So in my view, not using electronic cigarettes indoors is a courtesy issue. And for the large part, it's something that users don't do. But I think there are circumstances where it might be useful to be able to use electronic cigarettes in places where cigarettes are not permitted. And it was that very small area on the edge of what the Welsh legislation proposes that I disagree.
You want to know where that little place is.
Okay, well, one example, healthcare settings certainly spring to mind. Mental health settings, for example, have to deal with a population with a smoking prevalence of maybe 80% in severe and enduring mental illness. Very high levels of nicotine addiction and entrenchment of smoking in the whole cultures of mental health settings. Many people, and with varying degrees of success, are trying to make mental health providers smoke-free, but it is very difficult, particularly when people are distressed and first admitted. In those circumstances, it would be nice to say you can have a choice of nicotine products. We would recommend that you use a medicinal NRT, but if an electronic cigarette works for you, or if that person is already an electronic cigarette user, then say yes, you can use it. The same for hospital grounds, for example, where I think it's vital to make hospital grounds smoke-free so that my patients, respiratory patients sitting in the ward, don't look outside and see people smoking outside the window.
Could you both describe then the regulatory environment that you would like to see for e-cigarettes? I presume you both would like to see an effective public regulatory structure and framework for the manufacture and use of of e-cigarettes.
So, sorry, for use in public places? Or
No, what regulatory environment would you want for e-cigarettes?
we need something that's proportionate to the hazard. So at the moment we have a quite strange situation where the degree of regulation of nicotine products is quite the opposite of that. So the medicines end of the spectrum is very heavily regulated, very tightly controlled. The tobacco end of the spectrum now is regulated in terms of advertising and so on, but the product itself is exempt from consumer regulations because it's too hazardous. It would be nice to turn that around, but where we bring new products into the market, and electronic cigarettes being one of them, then the extent to which they are restricted, the extent to which manufacturing standards are imposed, should be proportionate to the risk. And whilst we've heard that the PHE figure, which originated with Professor David Nutt and his colleagues, that electronic cigarettes are about 5% of represent around 5% of the hazard of tobacco cigarettes. Personally, I think it's less than that, but it doesn't matter, it's very small. The degree of regulatory infringement on electronic cigarettes should be proportionate to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a rapidly changing environment. I think neither of us are saying that we need no regulation. And in fact, as we've heard today, age of sale, proxy sale, those types of policies are very important. But I think, as John says, the risk is that we will over-regulate. And I think the public places restriction, for me, the key thing is the message that it sends. Yeah. It's not an evidence-based measure. It sends a message that these products are as harmful as smoking and should be treated in the same way as tobacco, and they are not tobacco and they need to be dealt with differently.
I just want clarification before I move on to John. The bill actually does allow exemptions to be made, which cover, for example, and examples are such as what you have identified. Is it therefore that is not sufficient in your mind to allow the bill to stand in a wider public, is knowing that certain fringes, issues on the fringes you've identified could be exempt?
If I were designing the legislation, I would say leave it to the people who control the public spaces where these products might be used to formulate their own policy, either on simple grounds of their own needs, perhaps as an employer. An employer may say, I don't want people to use electronic cigarettes in the workplace because I don't want you pushing off for a break every 10 minutes. Not because of the health risk. So that would be one issue. A pub or a club may decide they want to allow to use them if that's what most of their clientele choose. But for the most part, the reality is that people are treating electronic cigarettes in much the same way as they treat tobacco cigarettes in indoor environments. But I would say, just as a simple anecdote, I travelled on the train from Stockholm Arlanda Airport into the city centre a few months back, and a young man was sitting in the seat opposite me using an electronic cigarette, a third-generation device, in his hand. He was drawing on it and breathing out with no vapour whatsoever, and I couldn't see how that in any way infringed or impinged on my freedom or right to clean air or anything else. It was utterly unobtrusive and perfectly reasonable.
John?
My experiences of sitting in cafes and breathing in vapour from e-cigarette use and finding the smell very unpleasant. But there we are, I suppose we're all individuals.
So, well, if I can, I think the products vary enormously, and some are designed to produce a huge plume of vapour, and others are designed with the opposite in mind for precisely the reason that we're discussing. And I agree with you, but I think that's a courtesy issue.
Yes, but you know, it's also for me one of public health and regulation and potentially law. Can I ask you, if you accept, as I think you have, that there is some health, some harm to people's health from using e-cigarettes, although I think you described it, John, as small, and you mentioned perhaps 5% of the harm that would result from use of tobacco. Nonetheless, given the the extent of harm from tobacco use, 5% I would have thought is quite significant. Yes. If there is that harm to people who use e-cigarettes, is there not a potential harm from what they exhale, having used those cigarettes, to others who are present in an enclosed public space?
Intuitively, you're absolutely right. I would say that I think the 5% figure is probably on the high side. But let's say it's 1%, and 1% of tobacco's harm would still be far from negligible. But those are estimates, and the hazard that comes from using an electronic cigarette will come from repeated inhalation of hot oxidant gases and gases with what appear to be very typically very low levels of other chemicals, most of them, if not all of them, in usual ways of use at levels that will be permitted in the workplace. That harm is concentrated in the lung and the rest of the body of the person who inhales it. What we do know of what is exhaled is that the toxic constituents of that vapour, from what is out there as evidence, is genuinely negligible. And it's not something that presents any greater hazard to anybody else than some of the things that Ms Williams has referred to.
Just very quickly, just to follow up on that, I mean, there are various things in the air that we breathe, which Kirsty Williams referred to. It seems to me it's not sensible to add, a new factor. I mean, isn't it more sensible to take a precautionary approach, given the importance of public health and safeguarding public health?
Given the role and the huge potential to benefit public health that a consumer-acceptable alternative to a highly toxic substance offers, I think we have to keep such precaution in perspective. And I would argue, just perhaps taking it a little further, that if we're going to draw the line at people exhaling electronic cigarette vapour, where do we stand? First of all, as and when electronic cigarettes receive medicines licence, some will in the next year or two probably. What do we say to those users? You can't use that licensed medicine in an enclosed space, perhaps even in a hospital. And secondly, what do we say to people who use asthma inhalers that generate the medicine itself, a steroid medicine, and the propellant, which is mostly inhaled, but some of it is exhaled? We don't have a problem with that. And I think we should be keeping that sense of proportion in looking at the hazard to others from electronic cigarettes.
Can I just add to